probably agree on.
Yeah, the playoff team for sure.
So do you.
I mean, I tell you what, I don't think there was a more accurate state. And
if they struggle again, I mean, I don't think there's any way you can keep Alex Critch, but.
What's going on, y'all? Bud Elliott here. This is my college football summer school series, and today, hook 'em. I want to talk Texas. I'm bringing on my man, Eric Henry from Horns 247. Dude, welcome to the show.
Appreciate it, Bud. Appreciate you having me on, man.
We used to talk all kinds of CUSA, and now we're talking Longhorns.
We go back a long way. The CUSA days is certainly one that we won't, we'll spare the folks that, but yeah, definitely a deep pull there.
Absolutely. But might have to have you on to reminisce about CUSA days when we're doing some of these CBS Sports Network shows and Liberty's blowing out Middle Tennessee by 50.
Anytime, man, most definitely.
Oh, man. So Texas last year did the thing that everybody claimed that Texas never does, which is like live up to expectations and actually win the games it should win and play to its talent level and actually made the playoff and came really close to actually playing for the national title if they can complete that pass there at the end. What's the general vibe around the Longhorns right now?
Listen, if you ask Steve Sarkisian, he believes that there is enough talent on this roster to not only pick up where the team left off last year, but really finish the job. I mean, and speaking with Sark, everything, throughout spring, the biggest thing he's hammered home is he feels that there's enough talent, especially when you get a guy like Quinn Ewers back on offense, a third-year starter. You get a guy like Jahdae Barron, a fifth-year guy back on defense, those culture setters who can carry over kind of that tone, that everything that last year's group went as far as finishing out the Big 12 schedule and coming together, carrying that over. But then you add in the new additions. We'll talk about some of the guys on offense, the receivers coming in via the transfer portal, some of the guys on defense, young guys like Anthony Hill who are ascending into new roles, that there's enough of kind of that old mixed in with the new, that this team is not only just as talented as last year's, but has enough to put it over the edge and really, get that goal of getting a national championship back to Austin.
Let's stay with that. And this might be a tough question to answer because that team was very good last year. But is there any spot in this team where you're like, oh, this is clearly better than it was last year?
Man, clearly better. You know what? I'll give you this one. This might be a bit of a hot take. I don't necessarily know if there's any spot that's clearly better. If I had to choose one, I'd say the edges, only because I think their production will be better. You look at guys like Barron Sorrell, Ethan Burke, they're another year ahead in the system. You bring in a Trey Moore, of course, who was, one of the nation's leading sack getters, and of course the 2023 American Athletic Conference Defensive Player of the Year. So you bring a guy like that, of course, Colin Simmons, he's gonna perform off the edge, you would think immediately. But here's my hot take, Bud, is at running back. It's almost going to sound crazy when you lose a guy like Jonathan Brooks to think that they could be clearly better. However, C.J. Baxter was the nation's #1 rated overall running back recruit for a reason. He got his feet wet last year. People forget that he was the starter when the season opener and, of course, closed the year after Jonathan Brooks' injury. I think he's going to be better. Jaden Blue is the name that you talk all across Austin, all across really the Lone Star State. It's got a guy who could be a breakout player, someone who's that 1-2 punch, and arguably the fastest player on the team. I think he's primed for a breakout year. And then also Trey Wisner. That's a name that when you talk with running backs coach Tashard Choice, he's very high on. Not a lot of people know that name right now. It was primarily a special team contributor last year. But I think if all three of those guys can stay healthy, they may eclipse last year's production.
I think you know this. I don't know how many listeners at home know this, but Ced Baxter actually played receiver a good bit as like a sophomore at Edgewater. They threw him the ball a ton. Like he actually has legitimate, not just swing route type hands. So I am fascinated to see how Steve Sarkisian is able to scheme up, some of those wheel routes and stuff with Baxter, because we know he likes to throw the ball, those guys out of the backfield. Let's fast forward, and kind of nice for you this year. SEC Media Days is actually in Texas, so not too much of a trip. You're at SEC Media Day. You look at the All SEC ballot. This guy is not on there, but you're like, all right, come into the season. He's an all SEC guy. There's the rest of the country, the rest of the conference doesn't know yet.
I mean, outside of Jaden Blue, I'll give you one. Manny Muhammad. Listen, the feeling here in Austin is whether it's this year or maybe as a junior, you're talking about a guy who's not only an all SEC talent, but an all-American type talent. You take a look, of course, Texas's secondary gave up its fair share of passing yards, although, Bud, this is, something I think you got to kind of dive into the numbers to really, pick this out, is that, listen, teams, when you have the third best run defense in the nation, and you got Tavondre Sweat, Byron Murphy, about halfway through the year, teams pretty much realized we're not going to run the ball on these guys. We're going to come out throwing. I think the Iowa State game, probably the best example of teams just abandoning the run in favor of the pass. So they did give up a fair amount of passing yards, with 12th in the Big 12 and overall passing yards. However, in terms of a sheer cover corner, Manny Muhammad has all of the traits. There's a reason why throughout spring, during player availability, Steve Sarkisian made him available, because there's that belief that, and look at it like this, to have enough belief to allow a guy like Terrence Brooks, who was a starter last year, to say, okay, we're going to mutually decide, hey, the portal might be the best option for you. That's the belief they have in Manny Muhammad. So he's got all the physical traits, all the tools. And I think, again, whether it's this year or next year, not only talking about an all SEC guy, but potentially an all-American type corner.
There's a little bit of a Pittsburgh Steelers 90s linebacker vibe to a couple of these moves in the SEC. The corner spot, as you mentioned, with Muhammad, I think at Georgia, being okay that Jamon Dumas-Johnson left for Kentucky, because they know just how damn good those second-year linebackers are going to be there in Athens. So I'm excited to watch him for sure. Another guy that everybody's excited to watch is Quinn Ewers. Where does Sarkisian want to see him take the next step? Because he was draft eligible, but decided to come back. So where does his draft stock improve? How does he get better? What does he need to get better at?
One of the most scrutinized aspects of Quinn's game is the deep ball, right? And I would make the case, listen, bud, I'm as big a Quinn Ewers fan as anybody. I'm of the belief that he's probably the most unappreciated player in the nation. Maybe not here in Austin. I think fans have really come around, and after the whole Arch mania, him coming in as a freshman and challenging for the role, and obviously last year Quinn rising to the occasion, I think fans here have really come around on Quinn. But nationally, I don't think he gets the respect he deserves. But if there's one aspect of his game that you probably want to see him take the next step, it's the deep ball. I mean, you take a look. Let's just use guys like Jaden Daniels and Caleb Williams, for example, in terms of passes that traveled more than 20 yards in the air, and I'm using Pro Football Focus for this metric. Those guys completed at least 50% of their passes. Jaden Daniels had a crazy numbers, like 67% of his passes completed. Of course, when you got great targets like he got at LSU, you expect that. But Quinn was around 36%. That's the bottom third of FBS starting quarterbacks. Part of that, in my mind, Bud, is just the fact that while Xavier Worthy and A.D. Mitchell lit the combine on fire, A.D. Mitchell ran 4.3. Xavier Worthy sets a new combine record for 40-yard dash time. Xavier's not the best 50-50 ball guy, and obviously that's a large measure of, completing those deep balls, right? If they're just going to run past guys, they certainly are equipped to do that, and Quinn can hit them. But those 50-50 balls, not necessarily their strong suit, or at least Xavier Worthy's primarily. I think this year you're going to see really Quinn kind of hone in on that, especially during spring ball. You saw him connecting with Isaiah Bond and guys like Matt Golden downfield. So that, I think, is really the one thing that separates Quinn from being, quote unquote, that good or really good quarterback to being elite and perceived as such nationally.
I look at what they brought into the transfer portal, and it's like speed. Hey, some more speed, a little more speed right there. Receiver got some speed, and it feels a little Miami Dolphins-ish to me. And so it's interesting, as far as the 50-50 stuff. Like, we've seen Bond make contested catches, obviously, at Alabama. How does this receiving core work differently than the one they just had?
It's really funny you talk about, you analogize them to the Miami Dolphins, right? Just get the ball in the hands of their playmakers, let him go. I asked Steve Sarkisian more or less that specific question during spring. I asked him, said, hey, you take a look at deep ball passing. I mean, even in the NFL, the deep ball's kind of down as far as the attempts, right? It's get the ball in the hands of your playmakers, let them create. And Steve said that, listen, in order for his offense, and really any offense, to operate at its fullest, you have to at least be able to threaten the defense at all levels, right? Part of that is taking the top off the defense. But with that being said, this is now 2 years running that he said, whether it was a Xavier Worthy or a A.D. Mitchell, or now guys like Isaiah Bond, a quick and shifty guy like a Silas Bolden or a Matt Golden, even a Jonte Cook, who was a 5-star recruit last year. You just want to get the ball in the hands of those guys and let them create, because listen, whether they catch it 60 yards downfield or they take it, 5 yards on a little hitch, a little slant, and take it 60 yards, it creates the same thing. So yes, I do think in essence, there is an aspect of that you'll see with this group, but all things considered, Bud, I think Steve wants to push the ball downfield, and especially I'll use Golden, for example, and even Bond. I mean, you've seen them be more or less reliable deep ball targets. And let's not forget Amari Niblack as well, big tight end from Alabama, 6'4", 235 pounds as well. So I do think you're going to see them want to push the ball downfield. But yes, there is an aspect of, let's call it, basketball on a football field, right? Just get the ball in the hands of those guys and let them create.
If I'm an SCD coordinator, and I mean, all this sounds great and is great, and Sark is one of the best offensive minds in the country, is this O-line good enough to punish me if I just sit back, drop 8, and say, you know what, cool, get some yards, we're going to win in the red zone, kick some field goals against us, right? Are they good enough to mash against that? Because Ewers is not really a run threat, so it's kind of more of a traditional run game type situation.
That's an excellent question. One of the things that I measured throughout last year, I mean, I even remember, Bud, they struggled in the red zone season opener against Rice. They had success against Alabama. They rose to the occasion. Of course, you go to Bryant-Denny Stadium, you get that win. Come back home to DKR. They struggled in the red zone against Wyoming. Struggled in the red zone in some of those games leading up to the Red River Shootout. And I asked Steve Sarkisian postgame of a game against Oklahoma where they failed in the red zone, failed in goal line, right? They looked disjointed. At times, you didn't know whether it was going to be the Tavondre Sweat, Byron Murphy package, or was it going to be the Savion Red Wildcat package, or were they just going to line up, and as you talked about, and just play traditional football? And Steve Sarkisian kind of, was not necessarily thrilled at the question in the immediate aftermath of that game, but he admitted as the season went on that, hey, we have to get better in the red zone. To your question, this offensive line, when we spoke with him last year, took it personally. Kelvin Banks being the most talented of that bunch, someone who's projected as a top 5, top 10 pick in next April's draft, said, hey, we had to have open and honest conversation with ourselves and say, we just got to, stop being white knuckled, be able to go up and punch guys in the face. Can they do it? I believe they can, just because in terms of sheer talent, you talk about a guy like Banks, you talk about a veteran center in Jake Majors, a big road grader at guard like DJ Campbell, someone who's north of 350 pounds. They have the guys to do it, but I hesitated in giving that answer because for all of the talent they have up there, they have to be able to go out and do it. And it's not just, Bud, a one-year sample size. You can go back to 2022 and see that even in, those 3rd and shorts and 4th and shorts that Steve Sarkisian likes to go for, situations when everyone in the stadium knows you got to run the ball, they've struggled. So we'll see.
All right. Because Google and YouTube are listening, I am contractually required to do this. Arch Manning. How many SEC teams would Arch Manning start for?
Wow. I am of the belief that Arch Manning would start for at least 9 SEC teams. I mean, my gut tells me, and listen, I'll just be, upfront. I just published something today that I said that there isn't a game on Texas's schedule that they don't walk into the stadium with the best quarterback. And that includes Georgia. I think Quinn Ewers is better than Carson Beck. So that probably gives a little bit of insight into what I think of the SEC quarterbacks this year. But with that being said, yeah, I mean, I guess you could maybe make some arguments for a couple teams here or there. But no, I mean, I think Tennessee lost Joe Milton, teams who've lost quarterbacks. Yeah, I to be honest, I'd say at least 10, maybe. Depends on how Oklahoma feels about like a Jackson Arnold, right? But no, I'd say at least 10.
Absolutely. That's bold, but I mean, you're probably going to be right. The kid is super talented, and the spring game looked great. Switching over to the defensive side of the ball, Texas signed a number of former 4- and 5-star guys, and they've lost a decent bit of production on that side of the ball at some spots. Who are like the next wave of Texas defenders? You mentioned Muhammad. Who else is going to be a household name in SEC country after this season?
Well, it starts with Anthony Hill, right? I mean, that's a guy who's uber talented, one of the most athletic linebackers you will come across, someone who's capable of rushing off the edge. Texas is actually looking at playing him at middle linebacker to replace Jalen Ford. And that just goes to show you how versatile he is. He's a guy who kind of patterns his game a little bit after Micah Parsons when you hear him talk about him. And Anthony Hill, of course, is from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So that's guy number one. But another name I think SEC fans should really get familiar with is defensive tackle Alfred Collins. He's a 5th-year guy who was a highly talented guy coming out of high school, great bloodlines. I mean, his mom played college basketball, so comes from an athletic family, athletic background. But the struggle with AC has been putting together consistency to match his immense talent. And Steve Sarkisian has been adamant that they felt that last year was the start of him really putting that together and kind of that third defensive tackle, fourth defensive tackle role behind, of course, Devondre Sweat and Byron Murphy. And this year, listen, but he could have gone pro last year. And to be honest, a guy like him at 6'4", 6'5", 320 pounds would have tested well. And, the NFL certainly has no shortage of a need for defensive tackles, but he came back with the intent to actualize on that potential and be the next Texas defensive tackle who's, a first or second round pick, right? So I would say get familiar with him as well. And one more I'll throw out in the secondary. I mean, I did talk about Jahdae Barron. I think he's one of the best nickel star players in the nation. But safety Derek Williams Jr., a true freshman last year who earned a starting role towards the end of last year. I think he's going to be a guy who has the potential to be one of the top safeties in the SEC.
What are the position battles, if there are any, that you're most looking forward to covering come fall camp?
I'll give you one on offense, one on defense. I know we talked about how loaded that wide receiver room is, but listen, look at Steve Sarkisian's history. 2021, 2022, that receiver rotation was really tight. They were only playing, really three guys. Last year, when we asked Sark about expanding that rotation, he said, the fact of the matter is guys like Jonte Cook, Ryan Niblett, DeAndre Moore, highly touted freshmen, weren't really going to crack that rotation because he had so much trust in Xavier Worthy, Jordan Whittington. Of course, you bring in A.D. Mitchell. Now, this year, more or less, Bud, it's even playing field, right? Because you talk about three transfers, Bolden, Golden, and Bond, who all come in at the same time. Well, Bolden just arrived, in the summer, but more or less all coming in for their first year. Jonte Cook has been here a year, and then you got true freshman Ryan Wingo, who had a heck of a spring game as well and a great spring. That's five guys I just counted who are all going to be vying for playing time. So I'll be interested to see how Steve Sarkisian manages that. And listen, he got a huge raise, so first world problems, but he's going to have to manage that. Then I flip it to the defensive tackle spot. That's one that I think gets really interesting. Again, Sark post the orange and white spring game said that he was confident with the starters on the defensive line. So you think that's going to be Alfred Collins. You think that's going to be fifth-year guy Vernon Broughton. But behind that, it's been a bit of a struggle. If I may use a baseball analogy, I think they're going to kind of moneyball this defensive tackle spot. You bring in a Tia Savea from Arizona pre-spring, and then you decide that some of the guys who you had on the roster, Sadir Mitchell, Jare Bledsoe, seemingly weren't, enough or weren't up to par. Aaron Bryant. So you bring in a Jermaine Lole, who of course is a seventh-year guy, goes back to his time at Arizona State, and others. You bring in, a guy like Bill Norton from Arizona, who played with, Tia Savea last year. So that's going to be interesting to see because listen, you got to have 5 and 6 defensive tackles to play per game, especially, in the early part of the season when it is scorching hot in Texas.
How much did Texas pay the SEC to get this schedule? I mean, they play 5 of the projected worst 6 SEC teams. That is, if I'm an Oklahoma fan, I'm pissed about this. We're like, wait, what? Texas got that, and we got to play this? I mean, this is pretty nice. And if you're a home Texas fan, like for your season tickets, you got to be. I mean, you'd be pretty happy to get to a new conference anyway, but got to be thrilled with this slate. How important is it for them to cash it in this year?
It's huge. It's huge. Again, I just wrote about this for the site that you talked about it. The fact that you don't get Tennessee, you don't get LSU, you don't get Missouri, you don't get Alabama, right? Like that's huge. You get no disrespect, but we'll see what happens with Jeff Lebby in year one at Mississippi State. You get Vanderbilt, obviously they're rebuilding. Billy Napier, a lot going on at Florida, they're rebuilding. Arkansas, same thing. So the fact that you get those teams, you get Georgia at home. I mean, listen, that's going to be a nuts weekend with Georgia at home, and then the F1 deal going on, not too far away. I mean, listen, but side note, I'm sure there are going to be a lot of people in Austin looking to put their apartments and homes up on Airbnb to make a buck there. But no, to your point, it's huge, and they have to do it this year. I think it's the same level of importance as I would say last year in terms of you needed to close the Big 12 with momentum entering the SEC. The expectation level is heightened, and maybe the urgency level should be heightened because of what you just mentioned with that schedule.
I'm looking forward to watching the season. I'm definitely going to be following all your coverage on Horns 247, man. I'm happy you're with us now. This is great.
Awesome, bud. Thank you, man. Appreciate you having me on.